Hello everyone, welcome to this lesson. The title of this lesson is French New Wave films. La Nouvelle Vague or the New Wave brought in a paradigm shift in French cinema in the 1950s and 1960s. It was one of the biggest intellectual and idiomatic earthquakes which remodeled the cinematic planet. According to John Baxter, the phrase Nouvelle Vague was coined by François Giroud, a journalist with L'Express magazine in 1953 to describe all creative young people who were disappointed with the mainstream French cinema of the 1950s, but had the conviction that it could be improved. However, later new young filmmakers appropriated the label to describe their films. The French New Wave film movement had a lasting influence on numerous filmmakers across the world. The ripples of the Nouvelle Vague are still being felt especially in experimental cinema. The French New Wave was a radical approach to the very institution of cinema, which had created a revolutionary shift in filmmaking practices, in film appreciation, and in cinema aesthetics. The French New Wave brought in many alternative approaches to film narrative, editing decisions, visual idiom, and in the selection of issues for generating social discourses through cinema. Learning objectives of this module are to enable the learner to understand the idea of New Wave film, to know the various historical factors that contributed to the arrival of New Wave films, to trace the origin and development of French New Wave cinema, and to familiarize themselves with major New Wave filmmakers and their films, to comprehend the characteristic styles of New Wave films, and to appreciate and critically respond to select French New Wave films. The French New Wave cinema, in a way, was the result of the interrogation of and resistance against the mainstream status quo film practices existed in France during the time. What was the problem with the existing or old wave films in France? The mainstream French films of the 1930s and 1940s failed to provide a realistic representation of post-Second World War life in France, especially those of the youth. Mainstream cinema of the period strictly adhered to the traditions of quality, so they were often referred to as cinema of quality or cinema de qualité. Max Ophuls' 1952 anthology film La Plaisir, House of Pleasures, is a perfect specimen of cinema of quality. La Plaisir is a cinematic adaptation of Guy de Maupassant's 3 short stories. The French quality movie of the 1950s could also be called as cinemas of craft because they engaged professional, experienced actors and established scriptwriters. Professional technical crew meticulously followed a prefixed rigid script. Shootings were confined to soundproof state-of-the-art studio sets, observed narrative linearity, and adapted impressionistic acting style. Because of this heavy dependence on senior artists and technicians in cinema industry, cinema de qualité were sarcastically called by François Truffaut as Daddy's cinema or Le Cinéma de Papa. Another example of cinema de qualité is Jules Onderdert's Forbidden Games 1952, directed by René Clément. This was also a cinematic adaptation of François Bois's novel with the same title. Most of such quality films were adaptations of canonical literary works. These quality films were idealistic, hero-oriented ones and had used well-rehearsed dialogues. Such highly artificialized films with very smoothly moving plots with continuity both spatially and temporally provided a romanticized utopian picture of contemporary French life. New Wave films rejected the French cinema of the qualité and classical Hollywood tradition of assembly line film production and continuity editing. The New Wave films were influenced by the film noir movies and Italian neorealist films. It's a generally accepted critical opinion that the French New Wave film movement officially got inaugurated with François Truffaut's film Les Quatre Cents Coups, 400 Blows, which was released in 1959. The New Wave receded slowly by 1962. More than 100 New Wave films, most of them directed by new young filmmakers who were in their 30s and 40s, were released in France from 1958 to 1969. François Truffaut's debut film, 400 Blows, follows the life of a rebellious adolescent boy, Anthony Doniel, played by Jean-Pierre Loud. This film was mostly shot in outdoor locations in Paris. How various social disciplinary mechanisms like family, school, police, judiciary, and prisons mishandle adolescent children's behavioral eccentricities lies at the thematic core of the film. In this semi-autobiographical cinematic narrative, François Truffaut shows how juvenile petty crimes, when handled unprofessionally, wreak havoc and leave the growing children shattered emotionally. The film's final iconic shot of the boy's stern gaze into the camera lens with the sea in the background leaves the audience feel ashamed and reminds them that each one of them is responsible for the boy's lost childhood and bleak future. Broken family and judgmental parents leave Anthony in total detachment both from the family and society with haunting traumatic memories. This film is dedicated to André Bazin, who was a patron of François Truffaut. Behind the emergence of the French New Wave films lies a curious discursive trajectory of cultural movement from film theory to film praxis. Actually, the ethos of these New Wave films had already been theoretically in the making process in the form of scholarly articles critiquing the mainstream French cinema of the time. Such articles began to appear from 1954 in the influential French film journal published from Paris, Cahiers du Cinéma, or Notebooks on Cinema, which was co-founded by André Bazin, Joseph-Marie Duca, and Jacques Valcroze in 1951. The journal used to publish high-quality theoretical essays on cinema and film appreciation articles, often with specific focus on film directors who exhibited signature cinematic styles in their creations. These film scholars who contributed to the journal include André Bazin, François Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, Jacques Rivette, Claude Chabrol, Doniol Valcroze, Eric Romer, and many others. Theoretically speaking, the idea of New Wave cinema originated in 1954, 5 years before the first New Wave film was released. In the January 1954 issue of Cahiers du Cinéma, François Truffaut wrote an essay entitled "Une certaine tendance du cinéma François," a certain tendency of French cinema, denouncing the popular, uncritical, simplistic movies which were primarily poor adaptations of literary works. Truffaut's 1954 article, A Certain Tendency of French Cinema, is considered to be the manifesto of the French New Wave films. In this article, Truffaut interrogates the then mainstream French cinema de qualité for their obsession with scenarios, for their unwarranted adherence to fidelity to literary works, pseudo-psychological realism, absence of signature aesthetic styles of the director, their pseudo-anti-bourgeois temperament, lack of real-life milieu, and their pleasing endings. Here is one of Truffaut's comments on the French cinema of quality tradition. The dominant trait of psychological realism is its anti-bourgeois will. But what are Oronte and Bost, Sigurd Janssen, Orton Lara, and Allegret, if not bourgeois? And what are the 50,000 new readers who do not fail to see each film from a novel, if not bourgeois? What then is the value of an anti-bourgeois cinema made by the bourgeois for the bourgeoisie? Workers, you know very well, do not appreciate this form of cinema at all, even when it aims at relating to them. They refuse to recognize themselves in French cinema of quality tradition. Alain René's film Hiroshima Mon Amour, Hiroshima My Love, is another universally celebrated early French New Wave film. Presented largely in a non-linear, piecemeal fragments of mnemonic narrative style, Hiroshima My Love is also about the broken relationships and haunting memories and recurrent amnesia of he and she, a couple with French, Japanese nationalities respectively, in the immediate backdrop of the American nuclear bombing of Hiroshima in 1945.
Comment aurais-je pu éviter de le voir?
Tu n'as pas vu d'hôpital à Hiroshima. Tu n'as rien vu à Hiroshima.
There is a mixing of the documentary style voiceover narration and with personal conversations strewn throughout the film. Political conflict during the World War II, love in the time of war, conflict between memory and amnesia, etc., intermingle in unregulated ways here. Just like the psychologically imbalanced mind of the narrator, long tracking shots move randomly through the city street of Hiroshima with a disconnected, illogical voiceover. The couple's intimate, amorous moments are captured in close-up shots, bringing the spectator very close to them to follow the meaning of such intimate conversations. Broken and almost desolated city of Hiroshima, with its hospital wards, polluted riverbanks to add to the general sense of loss. Discontinuity editing and episodic narrative structure brings in a new idiom of cinema in Hiroshima My Love. Another significant contribution to the French New Wave canon is Jean-Luc Godard's 1960 film Above the Souffle, Breathless, which features the life of an aimless and alienated young male protagonist who represents the depressed youth of the post-World War II Europe. With its frequent jump cuts, depiction of Paris city streets with its underworld filled with untrustworthy people, Breathless becomes a gripping cinematic narrative which ends with the expected death of the anti-hero. The Good Girls 1960 by Claude Chabrol, Cleo from 5 to 7 1964 by Agnes Varda, The Pyre 1962 by Chris Marker, and My Night with Maud 1969 by Eric Romer are some of the other important films belonging to the genre French New Wave films. After analyzing a small bunch of French New Wave film classics, the following features could be called as the trademark features of New Wave films. Discontinuity editing practice. Classic Hollywood films and French cinema de qualité followed a continuity editing practice in order to smoothen the temporal and thematic pace of the film. However, in New Wave films, an aesthetics of discontinuity editing is followed, which is achieved through spatial and temporal jumping through cinematic cuts. Alain René's film Hiroshima Mon Amour offers the finest example of jump cut. This brings in a sort of self-reflexivity and a deliberate reminder on watching the movie as a movie. This editing practice is also known as elliptical cuts because they erase and rearrange time and pace quickly in jerky fashion. Jump cuts were aimed at shaking the audience's complacent habit of cinema viewing. Introduction of Auteur Theory. The most distinctive and enduring theoretical contribution to cinema by the practitioners of the New Wave filmmaking and film appreciation is the introduction of the Auteur Theory. Auteur Theory elevates the status of filmmakers to that of an autonomous literary author who is the sole authority over the selection of the narrative style, construction of distinct plot structure, and creation of a unique aesthetic appeal. An auteur filmmaker leaves a signature mark on his films. Apart from this, auteurist features are reflected in the entire oeuvre of a filmmaker. For example, Godard's film style can be easily distinguishable from that of Truffaut. Cinema for the auteur filmmakers is a subjective work of art with an individual aura around it. Richard Newport says that, I quote, "The critical context of the French New Wave was permeated with concerns for individual cinematic stylists who developed distinct personal works. Auteurism was the battle cry for many of the cahier critics, and they certainly struggled to create their own thematic, mise-en-scène, editing, and sound strategies. Auteur filmmakers prioritized cinema as a form of art rather than a commercial product. New Wave films created the cult of iconic directors or absolute auteur. An auteur is at par with the painter, singer, or author in the context of French New Wave films. Preference for outdoor real location, light and sound. Whereas classical Hollywood movies and French cinema de qualité largely depended on artificially designed indoor studio sets, natural location outdoors or natural indoor shooting was preferred by the New Wave filmmakers. Rejection of artificial lighting and larger dependence on natural sunlight were other features of New Wave films. Natural or direct or live soundtracks recorded while shooting were mostly made use of in New Wave films. Dubbed or artificially added background score was normally rejected in New Wave films. Instead of a very strict script-bound dialogues, often spontaneous dialogues improvised during shooting are also primarily used in New Wave films. Elasticity of plot. Loosely structured plot that allowed improvisation during shooting are often featured in New Wave films. Melodrama, suspense, animated action scenes, and over-emotionalized human relationships were eschewed by the filmmakers of Cahiers du Cinéma legacy. An unheroic, often antisocial male protagonist and undomesticated female characters occupied the plot of these films. What actually made the arrival of New Wave cinema was the rejection of certain cinematic plot conventions followed in the mainstream movies. New Wave films are often juxtaposed with the classical Hollywood films to find out their essential paths of departures and digressions as far as plot construction was concerned. New Wave cinematic plots refuse to offer pleasing ending. The presence of a narrator, as if in a documentary format, is often seen in New Wave films. However, such films largely avoided providing a linear, logical narrative continuity. Rejection of big budget filmmaking. The New Wave films followed a modestly budgeted financial model by employing new or amateur actors, fresh technical crew, and by avoiding costly scenarios, etc. The widespread usage of handheld, portable, lightweight cameras made it easy for New Wave filmmakers to go for long shots in experimental fashion, thereby reducing expenditure on film stock and making editing job quicker and financially affordable. However, film historians like Michel Marie is critical of associating small budget filmmaking financial model with the New Wave films because she argues that as far as the standard budgeting of French cinema of the time, many of the New Wave films were not produced with small budget. Rejection of adaptation of literary works. New Wave filmmakers generally avoided adopting popular and canonical literary works and play texts. Even in the case of such adaptation, they argued that faithfulness or fidelity to literary work is not required when filming the literary work because essentially both genres speak in different idioms. Another reason for this rejection was the belief that, like literature writing, film writing, or writing with camera is also a creative endeavor. Chris Wiegand says that the French film critic and filmmaker, I quote, Alexandre Astruc, had put forward the notion of camera stylo or camera pen in an article published in La Écran Françoise in March 1948, and his manifesto had been quickly adopted by the Cahiers critics. In the essay, Astruc argued that cinema could have its own language, just like other arts. The Cahiers critics' writing meant that cinema's lowbrow reputation and short history were reassessed. Suddenly, certain westerns and gangster movies were equated in forms of artistic merit to impressionist painting and classic novels, unquote. Reflection of everyday life. A philosophy of everydayness, alienation from value systems, oppressive authoritarian social system, and a general sense of disillusionment prevails the milieu of the New Wave films. The New Wave movement attempted to create a new cinematic idiom and to communicate a fresh cinematic aesthetics through their realistic depiction of ordinary lives. The disillusioned New Wave male protagonists often represented people who are considered to be losers and loners with no definite pursuit of achieving something in their day-to-day lives. However, feminist film critics like Celia Genevieve opines that the New Wave rebellious male hero represents the right-wing politics of carrying a nostalgia for heroic masculinity, and the woman of New Wave films were rendered between modern and archaic, unquote. The British free cinema movement of the 1950s, direct cinema movement in the USA, and the left bank group of filmmakers are considered to be some of the direct inheritors of New Wave filmmaking practices. Thank you for watching the video.